Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you are enjoying this unseasonably cool weather. I say unseasonably because the part of the United States that I grew up in, August is the hottest month. It's my birthday month, so I know that because I felt like a French fry outside. I was always too hot on my birthday, and so this week has kind of taken me by surprise. But I hope you're managing to enjoy it. We've gotten some much needed rain. The sun is breaking through today, and so my spirits are indeed lifted, as I hope yours are also. I say that with a caveat. The sermon I preached on Sunday was kind of weighty. There's an apocalyptic intensity to the passage from Ezekiel. And I wanted to capture that because I think many of us probably feel some of that just looking at the various news programs and reflecting back on some of the events in our country and certainly in other countries like Sudan or Congo or Gaza, Palestine. Parts of our country have suffered as a result of fires. There have been floods. And so we grieve, we mourn, we pray, not only for those people, but for those persons that are able and willing to do something to mitigate that suffering. So when I read the passage from Ezekiel, from which I preached this last Sunday, I thought to myself, well, Ezekiel is decrying the bloody city, the city that has shed blood and has therefore indicted itself. It is found guilty of violating essentially the desires of God, right? The desires to have people living in right relation with one another, welcoming the widow, the orphan, and the stranger from outside your gates. According to this passage from Ezekiel, the city, and in Ezekiel's time, he means Jerusalem, but we could point to a number of cities. The city has committed a grave sin and violation and has essentially declared itself guilty. So I asked the question, and I posed it to all of you, is there such a thing as a city that's not bloody or that does not have blood on its hands? And that prompted me to look back at the origins of cities and the origins of what we would call intense, high-density human populations. And according to the research that I did, there is a certain structural violence that emerges fairly quickly. What begins as a kind of territorial formation, which is essentially just a redirecting of flows, material flows, and we could even say as persons of faith, recognizing that they had ritual-based communities as well, there were spiritual flows redirected. But as far as territorial creation is concerned, there's still a degree of flexibility. The center is not as focused, as concentrated as it will become later. However, in the formation of a territory, and you see me making the circle because it is a circular formation early on, in the formation of a territory, the periphery, the boundary of that particular territory experiences a certain violence. There is already a kind of maintenance of this border. It's not as rigid, it's not as fixed or determined as it will later become, but it's already there, at least in seed. Not to mention, when you've established a territory, you take from the periphery and bring into and distribute amongst those that live in that territory. In the process of doing that, you also begin to domesticate or select certain crops and animals that you then pen and use for your domestic goods, crops that you do the same thing with. You begin to cultivate and select out those you want from those you don't want. Well, the reduction in some of that natural biodiversity, as we all know now, has consequences that are mostly negative, because when you disrupt diversity, biodiversity, you expose yourself. So there's a vulnerability that comes in at the formation of these territories, a vulnerability that was noted. So by the time you get to the second stage, following the Neolithic, And this is the stage in which the biblical passage of Ezekiel, as well as the Christian scriptures, are composed. That second 5,000-year block, let's call it, for approximate anyway, that second block begins to concentrate all the resources. It creates huge storage sites for material power, grain storage, for political power, the king's palace, or the emperor, or whatever the name of that person would be, and spiritual power, the erection of a temple, right, or some sacred site where priest or a learned scribal class of persons spend time and make pronouncements that affect everybody in a given territory or region. In this second stage, as I've said, there's an intensification of the power from the center that is not so much about bringing stuff in, though that's still happening, but it's about distributing the command and going out, right? There's a new direction. We'll call the first one centrifugal and then the second one centripetal. And so I'm borrowing this from a former professor of mine. You don't need to know those terms, but just to understand there's a certain dynamic at play in the origins of cities, a dynamic that many of us are probably kind of uncomfortable with and we don't often think about. But it's clear, I think, if we just look at the record, that cities have often been established through violent means. And very often those cities create walls, boundaries that have an enforcement conducted by standing military. All of the resources that are required to maintain the city come from somewhere. And it's typically not the city, but it's from the outskirts, it's from the periphery. So why I think it's important to understand that is because the Torah, the Levitical Code, but also the commandments that Jesus highlights and emphasizes stress right relation. They emphasize the need for compassion, for hospitality, because to not be hospitable in that time and place was essentially a pronouncement of death on the person that was in great need. Now, this is true for a widow, orphan, but also a stranger, somebody you don't know that's not a part of your community. These are key virtues, core practices of both Jews and Christians for several hundred years. Now, we could quibble a little bit about how faithfully they practice them, but they're in the text, and they are certainly calling us to do as they instruct. And so when we look at those instructions and we look at the cities that exist and some of the violence that we've been willing to accept, it creates a tension. And that's where I wanted to place all of us, is in that space of tension, looking at some of those layers that are just underneath our comfortable and convenient lives, to see maybe what we're being called to do differently, what we're being called to look at. How can we mitigate or alleviate the suffering that some people are enduring? What are some of the steps that we can take as a community of faith? And specifically here at the church, what are some things that we have done, both intentionally and unintentionally, that have made some people feel unwelcome? It is our goal, it is always an aspiration to extend that extravagant welcome to all people. And I believe a passage like Ezekiel calls out not just our cities, but all the institutions and communities that are in these cities, like our church. So I hope you were able to take something from that sermon. I hope something I've said today might have deepened your interest or connection to the sermon as well as the passages from which we read. Would love to hear from you, would love to chat a little bit about this, because I think it's something that's going to continue to resurface and require something of us, and look forward to hearing what that is for you. Thank you for joining me today. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.